Is the world on the brink of World War III? That's the theme of our discussion with Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, who was later awarded the Intelligence Commendation Medal at his retirement. After the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro January 3rd, U.S. President Donald Trump has followed up by announcing intentions to do the same with Colombia and potentially even Mexico.
We've knocked out 97% of the drugs coming in by water, and we are going to start now hitting land with regard to the cartels. The cartels are running Mexico. It's very, very sad to watch and see what's happened to that country, but the cartels are running, and they're killing 250, 300,000 people in our country every single year.
He's made threats to take Greenland one way or another, citing national security reasons for the takeover.
We need Greenland for national security, not for minerals. We have so many sites for minerals and oil and everything. We have more oil than any other country in the world. We need Greenland for national security. And if you take a look at Greenland, you look up and down the coast, you have Russian and Chinese ships all over the place.
Meanwhile, Trump is ramping up defense spending. He has called for a $1.5 trillion budget in 2027, which is a 50% increase over current levels. The massive boost would partially fund his Golden Dome missile defense system and a new battleship program. Donald Trump has announced a return to the Donroe Doctrine, or what some people are now calling the Donroe Doctrine, basically asserting that the Western Hemisphere is a U.S. sphere of influence and foreign adversary presence will be effectively kicked out and left out. Will Trump then take over other South American countries soon? We'll find out. Tensions are simultaneously ratcheting up in other parts of the world as well. The U.S. Embassy in Kiev has just issued an evacuation security alert, citing that new airstrikes are imminent in the next few days. Meanwhile, Chinese jets were intercepted off Tokyo Bay in recent weeks, while the UK and France just signed a monumental agreement to put troops in Ukraine should a peace deal be reached between Ukraine and Russia without Western Europe's involvement. Ray McGovern now joins us to break down whether we are witnessing the birth of a new world order and what might come next. This video is sponsored by Kalshi. It is a fully regulated platform that lets you trade on real-world events, from economic data to political outcomes. Sign up and use my code LIN, L-I-N, link in the description down below, or scan the QR code here. New users will get $10 when you deposit $100. Traders can put money down on their favorite teams, events, elections, and more in all 50 states, including California and Texas, and over 140 countries. More on that later. Ray, welcome back to the show. Good to see you as always.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me back.
I want to start by showing you a clip of Tucker Carlson on his own show making the following statement. Take a listen. We'll react together.
Suggest that we're going to have a big war soon. The president announced that he is hiking the Pentagon budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Just announced that. That's the kind of budget that a country that anticipates a global or regional war has for its military. Obviously, we're moving in that direction toward a world war. Sorry. So how do you position yourself for that? Well, you look at a map and you ask, what areas do I want to control? Where are the trade routes? Who's got the resources? And if you were to do that, you would arrive at the most obvious conclusion of all, which is the United States has to have a relationship with Russia in order to survive anything like that.
Okay, I'll let you comment on what you just heard, Ray, and whether or not you share Tucker Carlson's sentiment. But I also have a follow-up question, which is why the U.S. currently has a quarter of its Navy floating around Venezuela.
Well, let's start with what Tucker said last. The U.S. has to have a relationship with Russia. Now, the question is whether these two things are contradictory. Russia has the upper hand in Ukraine and in Europe. Putin is the most perspicacious, the most cautious, the most statesmanlike figure that Russia has ever had. He is not going to be provoked into a nuclear war. The Caribbean is very far away, for China as well. Do they have interests there? Of course they do. Do they like what Trump is doing? Of course not. Do they like Trump boarding Russian flag ships? No, they don't like that at all. I think that's going to stop. Otherwise, what Trump does in his narcissistic, well, I would say, he's a little bit deranged. And if you look at the recent videos, I don't believe that President Trump is well. I think he's got carried away with megalomania. He thinks he can do all these things with that fellow Stephen, what's his name, goading him on, Stephen Miller. And there is a lot of unreality in Washington. So what do I perceive? I don't see a world war coming soon. I see a lot of destruction in our hemisphere. And if you look at the national security strategy that was approved by Trump about 2 months ago now, it singles out the Western Hemisphere for the concentration. It's the first on the item of strategic threats. Strategic threats? Well, you know what? A couple of months before the strategy came out, it was leaked to Politico. Politico pretty well plugged in. And what did Politico say about it? It said, yeah, the Western Hemisphere, yes, Venezuela, but also the homeland. And we used to call that the United States. We used to call that home. Now it's the homeland. And so I just warn all viewers that this may not be in the final printed national security strategy, but my guess is that it stayed in there because Trump wants to have troops at hand, not in the Pacific, not in the Atlantic, wants to have troops at home to protect the homeland. Oh, just in case there's more problems with ICE and the rest of it. And just in case before the midterms in November, these troops are needed for unruly cities and so forth. That's one of the real dangers that I focus on. It's a domestic problem. It's a domestic danger. And there are only the first glimmers that our Congress is cognizant of the fact that the executive has usurped their role, having to make wars or anything else. And the Senate today, actually, sort of the part of the Senate made the first move toward reining in Trump and saying, no, you can't do these things with our military without congressional consent or authorization. And of course, we hold the purse strings. So we'll see what the House does. But all I'm saying here is I had given up on Congress. The big thing, of course, is Congress is bought and sold by these people who'll be making $1.5 trillion. Is that what it is? Yeah. Billion, 100 billion, 150, 100, whatever it is they're going to make weapons that don't work. And the Russians make weapons that do work because they don't have the equivalent of a military-industrial complex. The people getting this money are making things like the F-35 that really could do a great job, except if it rains or except, blah, blah, blah. So all this money sunken into the military-industrial complex feeds the people who profiteer on this. And those of us that don't have any stock in the military-industrial complex suffer the consequences. We pay taxes, and taxes go to them.
Just on the note of Donald Trump talking about the rest of South America, which is what you just mentioned, take a listen to this 30-second clip.
All of these actions were in gross violation of the core principles of American foreign policy, dating back more than 2 centuries, and not anymore. All the way back, it dated to the Monroe Doctrines, and the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Donroe Document. I don't know. It's Monroe Doctrine. We sort of forgot about it. It was very important, but we forgot about it. We don't forget about it anymore. Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again.
What does this mean, Ray? What does this signal in terms of Donald Trump's next moves?
Well, it's a perversion of history, first and foremost. Monroe Doctrine, 1823.
Yes.
1823. The Donroe Document, the Kennedy Center now being the Donald J. Trump and John F. Kennedy Center. All these things being named. I mean, it sounds very much like the cult of personality, or worse still, acting like the Fuhrer. So that's an element here. The man is a little bit deranged, and he says, Donroe Doctrine, what does that mean? Well, the Monroe Doctrine meant look, we're not getting involved in any of these wars in Europe, okay? At the time, after the revolution, France said, look, you owe us big. You owe us big. Get in this war that we're waging against Britain. Come on, you owe us. And Monroe and the others said, forget about it. These are unwelcome interventions. We're not going to buy it. That was the deal. We're not going to get involved over there. Sure, it was applied in our hemisphere as well, but there was nothing about invading other countries to make sure that if they had a lot of oil, we could exploit it. There's nothing about the kind of naked aggression, not even disguised, but actually said to seize oil and other natural resources. Nothing about that in the Monroe Doctrine. I guess that has to be in the Donroe Doctrine.
Right. So is he actually going to execute this and ensure that the rest of South America is going to be an ironclad sphere of influence for America, which is, there's a few pillars to this. One, there's direct military control, perhaps. There's economic and political control. There's the dollar. There's the rampant use of the dollar across South America. And as was seen in Venezuela, Donald Trump can just directly take out a foreign leader. Will we see more of that happening in South America, do you think?
Well, under John Kennedy, we took out a foreign leader. His name was Diem, and he was head of South Vietnam. We all know how that came out, right? 58,000 U.S. troops killed, 3 million Vietnamese. I would refer you to this book that I have behind me over here, Precious Freedom, written by Pulitzer Prize winner James Bradley. It talks about why the Vietnamese won, not why the U.S. lost. Now, another book will be written 20 years from now. It'll be why the Venezuelans won, not why the U.S. lost. He doesn't realize it, Trump doesn't, but there's no way that he can rule or run, as he says, Venezuela without a bloodletting that you've never seen before, all since the conquistadores arrived in this part of the world. So it's very, very delusional. He can't even do Venezuela. Now, you're asking me to predict what Trump will do, and I am saying he's essentially unpredictable. He's mercurial. He changes his mind from week to week. So take my words for what they're worth. But there are limits to what he can do. And this little thing about what the Senate did just today gives me some hope that Congress will finally say, look, Article 1, Section 8 says we have the power to wage war. Don't you realize that? And besides, we also have the power to fund war, and we're not going to do that anymore unless you obey what the Constitution says.
This is the Venezuelans' main stock market, IBC. Huge jump since the events of earlier this year. And by the way, I've seen many comments on social media. I'm not speaking for all Venezuelans, but from the comments I've seen, a lot of people in Venezuela are celebrating the removal of Maduro. So markets in Venezuela certainly are celebrating this. It looks like the investment community in Venezuela or abroad investing in Venezuela think that this is going to be a good turn for the good for the entire economy. The question is, what's going to happen to the country now? So this is from Cauchy. It's a prediction market in the U.S. Who will lead Venezuela at the end of 2026? And traders are making predictions on the next leader. Delcy Rodriguez seems to be leading in this particular trade. Well, Ray, given your experience at the CIA, what typically happens, or what would typically happen after a leader is taken out by the United States? How would a transition of power take place? The U.S. wanted the leader gone. They got it. What's next?
Well, that's the key question, David, and you ask it as you always do. Now, usually, that is, if you're planning this kind of operation, you plan for day 2. You plan for day 3, and you plan for year 2 and 3. There is not one scintilla of evidence that the Trump administration has any plan at all for what they're going to do now. Remember, Trump up there with Hegseth on his left and Rubio on his right, and somebody asks, who's going to run Venezuela? And they look like deer in the headlights, and Trump says, I am. We are. Actually, Hegseth here and Rubio, they're going to do it. Well, give me a break. They can't do it. This is a bridge too far. And if the U.S. just wants us to focus on Venezuela, that's going to be more than enough for them to focus on, not to mention Colombia or the other countries that he's threatening, Cuba. Now, I'll say a special word about Cuba. We have an agreement with the Russians. It goes back to 1962 when I was first in the Army, as an officer down there in Georgia awaiting the invasion of Cuba. It was after the Cuban Missile Crisis at the very end. Was it resolved? Kennedy solemnly promised Khrushchev, we will not invade Cuba. Now, will you take your intermediate range missiles out of Cuba? Yes, he said, if you promise not to invade Cuba. On the side, Bobby worked out a little deal where we would also withdraw missiles that we had, similar to what the Russians had put into Cuba, from Turkey. And we did that silently about 6 months later. So that was part of the deal. But the deal was the deal. Now, the Russians aren't communists anymore. Cuba is. Will the Russians feel a little pressure to heed that deal if the U.S. invades Cuba? I suggest that Cuba is a very, very different animal than Venezuela, and the Russians just might send some warships into Cuban waters just to deter what Stephen Miller and Rubio and the others have in their mind if they want to do another Bay of Pigs invasion, and we know how that came out. Let me mention something here that's sort of interesting, and maybe I know better than most people. There is a national intelligence director. Her name is Tulsi Gabbard. She comes very highly recommended, and for the most part, she's been quite honest. For example, when Trump wanted to hit out and strike Iranian nuclear sites, Tulsi Gabbard said, well, you know that it has been the intelligence community's assessment since 2007 that Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon. She said that in March of last year, and then she said it again. Trump was asked about this on one of those plane rides, and he says, well, yeah, she said that, but I don't believe it. So she said that. It was accurate, and it's true. There is no sign that Iran is working on a nuclear. That's big. Okay, are they enriching uranium? Of course they are. They've been doing that since day one. Okay, but they stopped. They stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003, after we invaded Iraq, and have not resumed working on nuclear. Americans don't know that. Tulsi Gabbard knows that, and she had the guts to say it. Now, does she have purview over what the CIA does in Venezuela? She has titular purview. She's supposed to be able to look at covert action plans and comment on them after postmortem, okay? Did she get that opportunity? No. She was in Hawaii, and it's very clear, according to the latest Wall Street Journal, that she was cut out of this whole thing. Why? Well, your diagram shows why. Look at that stock of the defense industries. It's going way sky high. What does Tulsi Gabbard call those? She calls those the elite profiteers, political elites. She's just decried them. And she said last spring that these political elites, I'll quote her here, have these political elite warmongers brought us closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation than ever before in the past. Now, who are these political elite warmongers? Well, it's not Russia. It hardly could be the Europeans. She's talking about the Stephen Millers and the Rubios and the Hegseths, all those people, right? And so no wonder when they're planning to go ahead with this covert action in Venezuela, they went ahead without Tulsi. last thing here. This happened before, okay? The Bay of Pigs, where John F. Kennedy was mousetrapped into giving titular approval to something that Eisenhower already approved. He said, look, we're not going to support that. If you get caught on the beach, we're not going to support that with our armed forces. You know that? Okay, fine. They got caught on the beach. Kennedy kept his promise, saying, no, we're not going to get involved. There was outrage, okay? Now, we know how that came out. It came out in the way that Kennedy said, how could I have been so misguided? And then he looked at all the intelligence, and the intelligence, oh, Castro is going to surely fall as soon as we ride on the beach. There'll be an insurrection. And Kennedy said, hey, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., could you do a special assignment for me? I want to find out who those analysts were that gave that faulty information to me. Schlesinger spent 2 months doing it. You know what he found out? He found out that the analysis division of the fledgling CIA at the time was not only not consulted, it was not even told about the Bay of Pigs operation. The head of that, I used to work from, Ray Klein was his name, distinguished professor from Yale. He was not even told about what was going to happen. So Schlesinger says in his wisdom, look, you need to reorganize this thing because the covert action people are running things. They're not even asking for the views of analysts, because those analysts were very clear in saying, are you kidding me? Castro's not going to fall. He'll probably go man an artillery weapon and help wipe out those people on the beach, because that's what's going to happen. So what's the analogy here? This time we know, at least if the Wall Street Journal in this case can be believed, that Tulsi wasn't even asked. And so where's the intelligence coming to the Trump? This guy, what's John Ratcliffe? He's got the operators say, oh, yeah, we could do this. Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, yeah. Day 3, day 4. Well, don't worry about that. We'll run it. We'll run it. And that's what you get into when you use a central intelligence agency in a unrestrained way without the benefit of the cautions that the analysis division used to be able to give and did give, remember what I said before, with respect to whether Iran was working on a nuclear weapon. You could say, Netanyahu could say that 5 times at the UN. We said, and we stayed firm on that, and so did Tulsi Gabbard last year, that Iran was not working on a nuclear weapon and had not been since 2007. Now, all these things I feel very close to. Thanks for indulging me here, because I've been there, done that. I worked as a national intelligence officer. I ran national intelligence estimates. And the best part of my career was I briefed the president's daily brief, one-on-one, every other morning during the first years of the Reagan administration, 81 to 85.
Tell us about how the CIA operates now that you've talked about Tulsi Gabbard. Does the CIA have the authority to intervene in another country directly? We know they've done so in the past. What about going forward? And importantly, who or what has the power to challenge the United States when this does happen?
Well, there's a piece of legislation that says, when setting up the CIA, that the CIA shall perform such other functions and duties as the President of the United States shall from time to time direct. Now, that has been used in all kinds of unsavory manner. Torture, more recently, assassinations, the whole gamut of dirty tricks, okay? Do they have to tell the president? Well, there's something called plausible denial. Often the CIA guys know what's best for the country, right? And so they say, it's best to give the president the opportunity to plausibly deny that he knew anything about this, especially if it goes down and then goes sour. And so as often as not, and this is not recent knowledge, but as often as not, they say, well, Mr. President, Fidel Castro is really a bane on our existence. Would you agree? Yeah, and he'd probably be better if we got out of here. He's dead, right? Yeah, I think probably, okay, that's all they need, okay? So they perform such other functions and duties. Now, do they have to tell anybody? Well, they're supposed to tell 8 people in the Congress. That is a sick joke. that was put into legislation after they were caught assassinating people, caught poisoning people, caught doing domestic surveillance on war opposers. Okay. Now, the Church Committee, 1975, it came up with these conclusions. Legislation followed a couple of years later. It worked for a while. There was some supervision, but now we talk about oversight committees. Well, they've given a whole new meaning to oversight. It's not oversight, it's oversight. The CIA does what it wants to do. Usually it tells the president, sometimes not. And the president might feel a little queasy about coming after the CIA and saying, hey, I didn't authorize that, because the CIA has lots of ways of getting back at you.
Okay, so let's suppose you were at the CIA once more, and you were an analyst, and you were tasked to evaluate which other South American country after Venezuela would play a vital strategic part, or just be a vital strategic interest to the United States, essentially is evaluating the next Venezuela, so to speak. What would be your criteria? How would you go about making this assessment?
Well, we would have to start out with a paragraph on what's going to happen in Venezuela. And then we'd have to kind of look at the head of Colombia, who is no weak-kneed person. We'd have to look at Brazil, who feels strongly about what happened here. Look at some of the major powers there in Latin America. Do they rival the U.S. in military strength? No, but there are limits to what the U.S. can do. And so I expect that the focus will be, well, if I were an analyst, putting myself, I would say, Mr. President, it really depends on not only day 3, but month 3 in Venezuela. If you're really going to run that country, there's going to be a limited capability to do anything else with respect to Colombia. And after all, you've made transparent your objectives here. It has to do with oil, doesn't have to do with drugs, right? Now, Colombia has the drugs. Venezuela, yeah, it's not a drug threat. Even the Congress, even the DEA says that. So, except for these little boats, you got your hands full with Venezuela. We would suggest that if you tried to go into Colombia, that would be, other people have tried to go into Colombia and they failed. So you would tell us when you want to go into Colombia. We'll give you an updated assessment. On Vietnam, David, we used to get instructions from Lyndon Johnson. Okay, course A, we send in 100,000 more troops. What are the Russians and the Chinese going to do then? Course or option B, we send in 300,000 troops. What are they going to do then? Okay. Now, that was good because they consulted us. Did they heed us? No. We said they wouldn't do anything, but you're not going to win with 300,000 troops. This is odd. I'll just point it out. After World War II, one of the French military heroes, de Klerk was his name. They've named the tank after him. He was sent out to Southeast Asia to see if Southeast Asia could be won back for France. And he spent 6 months. And then he came back with a report and he said, we could put 500,000 men in Indochina and still we couldn't win. So fast forward, 1967, 556,000 troops, U.S. troops in Vietnam, and we could not win. And the reason we couldn't win is explained quite well in this book called Precious Freedom. Precious Freedom being a slogan out of Ho Chi Minh's mouth. And a person, James Bradley, who spent 10 years in Vietnam talking to the people who survived, talking to the people who really won the war, and found out, and this is a revelation to most people, why they won against the most powerful country in the world.
Okay, let's move on to Greenland now. Take a listen to what Stephen Miller, the Department of Homeland Security advisor, had to say about Greenland.
Rule out that the U.S. is ever going to try to take Greenland by force?
Well, let me go back a step. The president has been clear for months now. So I know you're treating this as breaking news. The president has been clear for months now that the United States should be the nation that has Greenland as part of our overall security apparatus. The United
Right, but
States,
your wife
NATO
posted that like hours after the Venezuela operation. That's why it's newly relevant.
No, I'll talk with you about it for an hour. I think it's a really important conversation. I just wanted to reset, Jake, by making clear that it has been the formal position of the U.S. government since the beginning of this administration, frankly, going back into the previous Trump administration, that Greenland should be part of the United States. The president has been very clear about that. That is the formal position of the U.S. government.
Right, but can you say that military action against Greenland is off the table?
It wouldn't be military action against Greenland. The Greenland has a population of 30,000 people, Jake. The real question is, by what right does Denmark assert control over Greenland? What is the basis of their territorial claim? What is their basis of having Greenland as a colony of Denmark? The United States is the power of NATO. For the United States to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States.
So here we have a prediction market once more. What will the U.S. take control of Greenland? Any part of Greenland? 38.3% chance traders are placing on this particular outcome. And by the way, leaders of Europe, not counting the UK, have banded together to unanimously denounce and oppose this statement from Stephen Miller and the Trump administration stance. And Miller was right. The Trump administration has been talking about this for months, since the beginning of the year. The Danish government laughed at them at the time. They're really not laughing now. In fact, the Danish PM just issued a public statement about this, saying that this is completely unnecessary. I'm paraphrasing her. And so what would happen if the U.S. were to move against Greenland in one way or another? What would be the European response, do you think?
Well, my expertise is Russian, and I would prefer to address the Russian response. And the Russian would say, my God, this is the end of NATO. We sort of predicted the end of NATO when they couldn't steal our money. And when the U.S. said they wouldn't send any more money or arms to Ukraine, that was enough. But now, okay, my God, the U.S. is going to attack a NATO nation. Now, some of the NATO nations have actually said, oh, that wouldn't be a good idea. But if the U.S. does it anyway, what's left of this alliance? This is big. I mean, the Russians are not responsible for NATO withering away or splitting up, but they're laughing at it. Now, with respect to the Europeans, they're very clear on what's running the White House. Stephen Miller and his wife, by the way, did a graphic where she painted Greenland in red, white, and blue as if the United States flag, and she put on top of that little Twitter, she said, "Next."
Yeah.
So this is delusional. Now, can they take Greenland? Of course they can take Greenland, okay? They have a big base there already. But do they really need to do that? No, I don't think so. I think Trump is just trying to flex all his muscles because he knows that he can't take on Russia. He can't take on China. I mean, Russia and China are together as never before. I think that Trump, when he watched that gathering in Beijing on the 3rd of September, on Victory Against Japan Day, and remember, the Chinese lost almost as many troops, almost as many people as Russia did in World War II. Russia lost 27 million. I think the figures for China is about 21 million. This was a big celebration. Who wasn't there? Trump. The rest of the world was there, and they flexed their muscles and they said, look, this is the future, and the power is drifting from west to east, and the BRICS countries and everybody are saying, yeah, that's the way it is, including financially. I believe that Trump looked at that and he said, oh my God, can we win? can we really beat China? Can we have the Navy that beat China? And the people came back and said, well, actually, the last three war games we had, China won. How quickly? 3 days and 5 days. Then the last one was 2 days. How about Russia? Well, Russia has these incredible hypersonic missiles and ones that go around the South Pole and ones that go into no, we can't beat them either. Okay. This is my idea what happened. Trump says, where can we show our muscle? Well, we show our muscle in the Western Hemisphere. And Mr. Trump, you might need the troops to put down domestic unrest at some point during your tenure, okay? So that's the new national security guidance, where we focus on the Western Hemisphere, where we have our writ. Now, let me draw something from my experience here. This happened before when I was on active duty with the CIA, and actually when I was briefing one-on-one downtown. 1983, okay? We had 241 U.S. Marines killed by a bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. Reagan was in charge. He said, what the hell are they doing there? Well, we thought we should have a presence there. Well, they're dead, right? Yeah, they're dead. And who else you got there? Well, we got get those people out of there. Get those out of there and stop those battleships from firing on the heights there in Syria. Bring them back. Okay, that was pretty slinking away. Now, what are we going to do to compensate for that? Weinberger and others said we have to show that we can still be strong. What do? Oh, there's a regime in the small island of Grenada. Actually, it's right off Venezuela, and they have a leftist regime there. We have medical students there. They might kidnap them, and there's a big airstrip there that the Cubans might use. I think we need to invade Grenada with the 82nd Airborne just to show that they're not going to kidnap our students. They never threatened to. And the Cubans are not going to come and use their air. They never threatened to. I was there. I saw that happen. That was why the Grenadian government, such as it was, cried uncle 2 hours or 3 hours before the 82nd was sent in there. Now, this was a demonstration of our power. So if you see the parallel here, I think Trump was looking, oh my God, we can't prevail in Asia or even against the Russians worldwide. Let's prevail where we can, and let's name the Donroe Doctrine, the Donroe Doctrine. We'll show them who's boss. I think it's more than a little delusional. I do think that Donald J. Trump is not well. That has incredible implications. If I'm Putin looking on there, and I look at that performance, and I find out not only is he mercurial and unpredictable, but not well.
I want to go back to your earlier statement, though, Ray, about you said Donald Trump is flexing his muscles because he knows he can't take on Russia and China. What do you mean by that? If, let's say, tomorrow a war broke out between the U.S., Russia, and China, suppose Russia and China formed a de facto alliance, would the U.S. win or lose?
Lose. But the good news for your viewers, it's not going to happen. You know, it sounds strange.
How did that happen? The U.S. had military hegemony for 70 years. At what point did this shift?
Well, you know, it's with respect to Russia, when Putin came in, the country was on its back, economically, militarily. Little by little, he improved the economy, improved the military to the point where when the flap went up in Ukraine, they had a credible military force. And by now, they have the most credible military force in Eurasia, okay? So what was the U.S. doing? They were developing really sophisticated air defense systems that don't work. They were developing F-35s that have all the bells and whistles on them but don't work in the rain. They've been developing all kinds of things like a big naval ship that they spent $8 billion on, and now it's mothballed because it doesn't work. All this stuff is not aimed at making the U.S. forces more operational. It's aimed at making money for Lockheed and Raytheon and the rest of those guys. So that's why it all happened, in my view. Now, when you say World War, again, I just have to say that we are very fortunate in having a self-confident casual, kind of a cautious person in Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He and she know that they have the upper hand in the world. They're in no hurry to demonstrate their strength, but if they have to, they will. Now, there's one little thing that people have not focused on. Maybe I could point it out because I think it's terribly important. About a week ago, there was an attack on one of Putin's homesteads. This was near Valdai, which is about halfway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. 91 drones. Some of them got pretty close, but they were all shot down. Now, one of those drones had its components, its guidance, its, what do they call it here? It's, I got the right terminology. Its flight controller instrument was intact. What did the Russians do? They looked at where that drone was targeted. And it showed conclusively that it was targeted at Putin's residence, whatever else might be in the residence, command center or whatever, okay? What did they do? They took that and they gave it very ostentatiously, all filmed, to the U.S. Defense Attaché in Moscow. That was about 4 days ago. It's in Washington now, okay? Why do I mention all this? Because Trump initially said, you know, when Putin told me that they did this, I said, oh, that's awful. So I believe Putin. And then all these other people say, oh, Putin's a liar. Well, now the die is cast. The hardware is there. The controller that has the gyroscope and all. Okay, so now will the U.S. lie about that? In other words, it is inconceivable to me that the Russians will handle all of this stuff if it didn't prove what Putin is saying, okay? Now, what will Trump do? Now, he's a choice. He can say, oh my God, Putin's right. Who the hell targeted these drones? And it would be somebody in Ukraine, maybe the British, or maybe some other NATO thing. Probably not U.S. forces, okay? Or will he say, I don't believe Putin? Now, if he says, I don't believe Putin, that's the end of the trust, without which rapprochement, without which any decent relationship can be built between the United States and Russia. Does that matter to the Russians? It does. The Russians want a decent relationship, but is it catastrophe? No, the Russians will move in Ukraine. They'll just have to take more territory and not look with much hope to a settlement that embodies their core interests, but rather just have to do this all militarily. Will it matter to Trump? Well, he keeps saying he wants a decent relationship with Russia. So here's the litmus test. Will the U.S. say that Putin was right, even if he was right, or are they going to distort it? And if you leave it up to the CIA, mark my words, they will distort it, and that'll be the end of U.S.-Russia decent relations.
I want to move on to Russia and Ukraine now, but before we do that, does it seem odd to you, Ray, that Russia and China have been relatively muted about the capture of Maduro? I mean, they've issued a statement saying you have to release Maduro, but they're not really doing anything about it. Does their silence or lack of action surprise you at all?
No. As I said before, I think they're laughing. They're saying, didn't anybody tell Trump about Vietnam? Doesn't Trump know that Venezuela is 3 times as big? It's got forests and jungles and so forth. I mean, oh my God, Trump's bit off a lot more than he can chew, and it's way the hell away from us. That's not a concern. Yeah, we have economic investment here. Yeah, we don't like our flagged ships, Chinese or Russian, being apprehended. But, you know, these are little pinpricks. We got the thing going here in the Eastern Pacific, or the Western Pacific, because the U.S. has given up on challenging us militarily there. And in Ukraine, well, it's just a matter of months at most that the Ukrainian forces will have suffered extremely great casualties. Will just waste away, and then they'll have to work on the Nazis that are still running that government. That can be done if the Nazis have no army.
This just came in, bombshell announcement. The UK and France have agreed to put troops in Ukraine if a peace deal were made. Yeah. After talks with Ukraine's allies in Paris, he said that Keir Starmer said that the UK and France would establish military hubs across Ukraine to deter future invasion, while the French President Emmanuel Macron later said thousands of troops may be deployed. Putin has warned that this is a red line that can never be crossed. He said Russia has repeatedly warned that any foreign troops in Ukraine would be a legitimate target. So if the US and Ukraine and Russia were to reach a deal by themselves without Western Europe's involvement, this is what the UK and France would do. Basically, if the peace deal were to be made such that the east of Ukraine were to be kept by Russia, and that would be the deal, Europe's not going to be happy about that. They're going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine to do what exactly, Ray? What are they trying to do?
This, too, is delusional, David. I mean, did I say the Russians are laughing their heads off? Well, they're laughing themselves sick now. The whole thing depends on if there's an agreement, right? There's not going to be any agreement, okay? Because the Ukrainians resist that with the help of the Europeans. So if this is all premised on the nature of the fact that there'd be some sort of agreement, and then these forces would come in to monitor it or to verify it, well, they're not coming into the part of Ukraine that Russia has decided it needs to grab and has grabbed. And the whole notion of them coming in now, well, Putin has warned pretty specifically that they would be considered fair game for shooting them up. Bear in mind that there have been many, many hundreds of NATO troops already bit the dust at the end of Russian missiles and other weapons in Ukraine. The advisors have been inept, and now a lot of them are dead. So this would be just repeating that experience.
I find it very odd that the UK and the British and the French are making this announcement this week, right after Trump and Stephen Miller have reiterated their plans or ambition to take over Greenland. Like you said, if they were to do that, that would basically be the end of NATO. And now they're threatening to put troops in Ukraine. So if NATO disbands and Russia attacks the UK and France, the United States has no obligation to back them. I mean, why would the French and the British do this? Can you help us understand?
The answer is, I can't help you understand that unless I persuade you that these people, I'm talking about Macron, the guy in England, what's his name, Starmer, that they really are vulnerable to their own populations for pushing billions and billions of much needed funds into the Ukraine adventure and now having it just slip apart. The elections are coming up in all of those countries within the next year or year and a half. These people are going to lose power. They're going to be disgraced, and worse could happen to them. They frittered away a lot of money without any real approval by their population or their parliaments. So they have this personal need to show their strength. It's all laughable in terms of Moscow's lookout here.
I mean, at this point, why not just directly attack Moscow? That's basically what you're going to do. If you're going to send troops into Ukraine, why not just go to Moscow directly? Skip the middleman.
Well, if they try to do that, then and only then, Moscow would get on the horn to the United States and say, look, we don't really like the fact that do you approve this, or this a NATO operation? No. Okay. Well, I'm sorry about this, but we're going to have to send some of our Reshnik missiles to destroy London Tower or the Eiffel Tower or something like that. We don't want to do this. Do you think it can constrain your people to do these crazy things? Because we'll give you 2 days. If not, then we're going to. I mean, then and only then. Because NATO is ostensibly an Article 5 treaty where aggression against one party is treated as aggression against all. And it's important to note that it's the parliaments of these various cities that decide how to react. That's not automatic. But, the ironic thing is that Putin himself has pointed out that without the United States, there's no NATO, okay? He pointed that out at the end of a long speech. People are asking about this. Look, he says, have you read the new U.S. national security strategy? Have you read it? Can you read? Says Putin. It says we are not enemy number one anymore. We're partners. They're working with us. Okay, that's over. Okay. What about Europe? Well, they say some really bad things about Europe, and they say our priority, that is U.S. priority, is to work out some kind of a deal on Ukraine so that we can have better relationship with Russia, which is our overarching aim. So read the document, for God's sake. Without the U.S., NATO is nothing. NATO has fallen apart here. You don't even have Hungary or Slovakia or sometimes other countries chipping in here. The last straw in some senses was trying to steal Russian assets, and that failed miserably. So forget about it. Let's just wait. We're patient. Chinese wait for centuries. Russians wait for decades. It'll all come out to their advantage as long as Trump doesn't get access to the nuclear codes and do something really stupid. For that, they're prepared.
Well, let's finish the conversation here. Anything that you think will be monumentally stupid that will happen in the next couple of years? In other words, Ray, any political or geopolitical flashpoints you're really watching out for in the coming months or years?
This is very hard to predict because there are several unpredictable forces in NATO. I mentioned the Baltic states, for example. Some of them keep talking about going after Kaliningrad, which is sort of an exclave. It's a part of Russia, but it's outside of Russia. It's right around Poland and Lithuania, okay? They talk about cutting that off. That would be a casus belli. Otherwise, well, if they shoot a drone and kill Putin, that too is a casus belli. But, the Russians are not going to be provoked into World War III. Now, I may be an outlier here, but I've watched Soviet and Russian leaders for 6 decades, okay? And none has been as wise, cautious, and smart as Vladimir Putin, who has built up this country again from nothing without any help from the West, and now has the most potent military force, not only in conventional weaponry, but in strategic weaponry. He's not going to be provoked into having to use that. He doesn't want his country to perish from the sides of the earth. When he's asked about this after his last election, say, what would you really retaliate if it meant the end of the world? And his answer was, well, what would the world be without Russia? Okay, of course I would retaliate. So if you're talking about luck, if you want to look at something good for the rest of this year, is that Putin has a way of talking to Trump, has a way of talking with the Americans, with Biden didn't, and will try his best to cool things down. So the U.S. does these crazy things in the Western Hemisphere. It relents on Ukraine. Russia wins. There's some sort of settlement that's worked out. And hopefully the worst can be, it takes 2 to tango, I'm saying. The Russians are not going to tango unless there's a real in extremis kind of move from Lithuania or Poland or something like that.
Finally, do recent developments change your outlook on China and Taiwan? Is China more likely to move against Taiwan after what happened with Venezuela, for example?
No. My first portfolio was Russian policy or Soviet policy toward China. So I learned a little bit about how the Chinese act in these decades. They're slow. They take the long. They will get Taiwan eventually. There's no rush. The U.S. made a deal, very adroit, very diplomatic deal, saying, yeah, Taiwan is part of China. It's going to happen. They don't like $18 billion more of weaponry going into Taiwan, but they have just as much capability to deter that weaponry, and if worse comes to worse, to use it, so use their own. So no, I'd say pretty confidently, and I consult with my Chinese analyst friends regularly, they're not going to be provoked either. And it's good news that China and the Asian Pacific has gone down to a third or fourth place in this strategy, because until this new strategy, they're right up there on top, and we had to build these warships to contend with China, which we never could do. But the Chinese have more warships than we do. Now, not as big, so they're not as big a target, but they, these people have capabilities that didn't used to have. And together, I mean, if Russia is attacked or China is attacked, mark my words, they'll reply in a unified way. And that's what all sensible U.S. policymakers tried to prevent ever since 1963, when I entered the CIA and started working on these problems.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Ray, for your time today and your thoughts. Let's keep tabs on what happens next. Very interesting and volatile times we live in. Where can we follow you and learn more about you in the meantime?
Well, I do X, and that's at raymcgovern.com. No, at Ray McGovern. My website is raymcgovern.com. And as some people know, I'm twice on Judge Napolitano's Judging Freedom, 10 o'clock Monday morning and 4 o'clock Friday afternoon. So they can catch me for half an hour on each of those appearances on YouTube.
All right. We'll put the links down below, so follow Ray McGovern there. Thanks again, Ray. We'll speak again soon. Take care for now.
Thank you, David.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow Ray in the links down below. And don't forget to use my code LIN, L-I-N, when you sign up to Kalshi. Link down below, or scan the QR code here. New users will get $10 when you deposit $100 for your first trades.